Physical media is dying.
A lot of these gaming companies would like nothing better than to see your preservation, your ownership of your video game being thrown away.
Oh, hell no!
Hello everyone. 10 years ago, if you asked anyone that digital distribution would be the prevailing norm for video games, you'd be laughed out of the room. You'd feel embarrassed for saying something that would challenge the status quo within the video game industry. But as the industry evolves, so is the method of the distribution of video games. Physical video games were once the only form of game distribution that you could still receive, right? And even when digital media was in its infancy, it was still the go-to place for all of the major video games. You could pop in at a normal game store, look for whatever game you wanted to buy, take it to the till, and there you have it, you have your game. Even 10 years ago when the 8th generation consoles released, this was the norm. This was like the reality back then. Today, we have digital-only consoles, a growing number of games that are completely forgoing physical releases, a dwindling physical market, especially in the West, and with the recent news that Best Buy has decided to set a precedent by removing physical copies of movies entirely, this may one day extend to video games, and some retailers have already considered this happening in the future. Are physical games truly well undone for? Is digital truly the future, or is there still a market for physical media? So in this video, I want to talk about the state of physical games and whether it's still feasible as a medium for game distribution. The 7th generation of consoles was where a lot of what forms our modern digital ecosystem today was established. These consoles were designed to do more than just play video games. They were going to be media powerhouses, allow you to use expandable storage beyond anything that a memory card could do, and above all, they had prioritized tapping into the massive potential provided by the internet. All three consoles, the PS3, the Xbox 360 and the Nintendo Wii, they all provided a new way for developers to push their games to their audiences with the advent of digital distribution. But back then, it just didn't start off as offering full-fat games that you'd see in a video game store or a department chain. The Xbox 360 brought an Xbox Live Arcade, and it was originally an experimental service for the original Xbox that was launched towards the end of that console's life cycle. But on the 360, Xbox Live Arcade, it was revolutionary for consoles at the time. Developers had realised that the cost of providing games on the Xbox Live Marketplace, it was cheaper than having to factor in the cost of pressing games on disc. And what's more was the fact that you could sell those games for extremely cheap prices. Xbox Live Arcade was where indie games would immediately thrive on the platform. We're talking about the likes of Pac-Man Championship Edition, Braid, Geometry Wars, and Castle Crashers to name a few. Big publishers also used it as an opportunity to resell the older games that would have been completely lost to time, like Castlevania Symphony of the Night from Konami, and Sega used Xbox Live Arcade as a springboard to release their older games from the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis if you live in the US, and Dreamcast eras. There were limits, however. During the early years of Xbox Live Arcade, there were file size limits to make sure that certain games could meet the storage requirements of the 360, but over time it grew from 50 megabytes to 150 megabytes to 350 megabytes and finally 2 gigabytes as the 360 started to catch up with advancements in internet speeds and bigger storage. As for Nintendo, right, they took a different path with their Wii's digital storefront. WiiWare was designed for smaller titles to thrive in the digital ecosystem, but there were limits of course. You could only release a game that met the 40 megabyte requirement, which is so tiny. Nintendo imposed this, and this requirement was so limiting that certain developers had to rule out the Wii entirely for their game releases. And it was an interesting approach that Nintendo had taken to, of course, boost the Wii's online services. The real deal, however, was the Virtual Console. Nintendo had a wealth of games that they were regularly releasing digitally to give people an easy way to relive those classics from the NES, SNES and N64 eras. And it wasn't just Nintendo's older consoles where you could buy all the games from the Virtual Console. Nintendo decided to make deals with Sega and Hudson Soft to allow the Wii owners to buy Master System, Mega Drive and all Genesis of course, and TurboGrafx 16 games from the Wii shop. Nintendo's approach to digital games throughout the 7th generation console's lifespan was a commendable one, but it never went as far as Microsoft did with the Xbox Live Arcade. But their approach to allowing their retro titles to be purchased digitally was a great if not underrated selling point of the Wii. But the biggest failing of the Wii's digital ecosystem was the fact that everything you purchased was tied to the console, not an account. So if your Wii died, say goodbye to your entire Virtual Console and WiiWare library. That is not a good thing for preservation, right? Last but definitely not the least was the PlayStation 3, and it's a system that definitely had the rockiest start. Its online functions were a huge improvement from PS2, but PS in its early days, it wasn't great. The The PS Store wasn't even built into the system's firmware, and it existed as a website to download a few games it offered. Sony provided a couple of smaller games like Crash Commando, Flow and Blast Factor to give people an idea of the kind of games you could expect from the PS Store, but it just wasn't as plentiful as what Xbox Live Arcade offered. Like with Nintendo, Sony decided to offer a growing number of PS1 games alongside the games they already had on disc, but over time the PS Store started to receive more critically acclaimed games like Flower and Wiper HD, and it received an overdue redesign that finally made it a usable and intuitive experience. But despite this, there was something up both Sony and Microsoft's sleeve that was going to provide significant value for their digital storefronts in the long term. As digital games began to grow for not only platform holders and developers looking to escape the costs of printing games physically, the opportunity came for Microsoft to monetize big retail releases on their storefront. So they announced the Games on Demand program at E3 2009, and they launched it in August of the same year. So Games on Demand was essentially the digital versions of your retail games. They were being sold for $20 to $30 a piece, with the biggest advantage being that you could have your game downloaded directly to your console like with Xbox Live Arcade. And it was just convenient, you didn't need to go all the way to your local video game shop to pick up and play. You could just download the game. The problem though was that back in 2009, internet speeds weren't that great for downloading large games at the time, and they were costly. You could instead save that amount of money for getting the games physically instead, and what's more, if you had an Xbox 360 hard drive, you could just install it to boost load times anyway. Sony followed up on this not long in 2010. They were gradually adding the PS3's retail back catalogue on the PS Store, but they dramatically started adding more stuff in 2011. The same premise is there like with Games on Demand on the 360, but the internet connection speeds and the pricing just didn't match up with the value that you could get for buying a game physically. I owned the PS3 during my childhood. I can just tell you that download speeds for that were atrociously slow. It was fine for smaller games like Sonic Adventure, which I had a blast with, but full retail games? Nah, not with that. It also didn't help that the install process for PS2 games was super slow, so you had to reserve half of your storage to download one game, and once it was downloaded, you had to wait for it to install. You couldn't even use the home screen back then. And as for pricing, they were releasing new games at around £48, where you could find the same game on a physical copy for half the price, or even less than that. Sony also brought the digital pre-order system to console for the very first time, so when Battlefield 3 was about to release, they had tried a day-and-date release digitally, and they allowed you to preload the game. So slowly but surely, they were future-proofing the digital ecosystem in preparation for the next consoles. Because the 7th generation consoles were a way to get to grips with digital distribution, they realised that they could cut out the middleman and caught more developers to try their hand at a growing digital market on console. Both Sony and Microsoft continued to do this. They added more games as a day-and-date release on the digital stores, alongside buying the game on a physical disc. But in 2012, Sony also introduced the Instant Game Collection on PS Plus. So you would get a set of games offered every month with your subscription, and the value was immense. Tons of recent releases were being offered with that subscription for just $50 a year at a time, and I feel that definitely did drive digital adoption towards the end of that generation. And Microsoft, they took notice of that. They decided to boost their gold membership with Games with Gold. The difference though between the PS3 and the 360 was that on the 360 you got to keep your game that you claimed with your subscription, and you get around 2 games a month. However, the next generation of consoles would have untold effects on the future of physical games. The 8th generation of consoles was known as the ecosystem generation for that very reason. Digital libraries became incredibly important. It was also a massive opportunity for Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo to boost their digital storefront significantly. Nintendo was finally able to offer full fat digital releases on Wii U, but you could tell they were still flagging. It's still a digital content tied to the system instead of a Nintendo account, and they had been pretty slow to adapt into digital distribution for a good while. Microsoft, we're going to be talking about them briefly, because their plans for a digital feature were way too ahead of how the video game market in 2013 was. Physical media was still popular, it was still the go-to for most people. Though it was undeniable that digital games have grown year on year, Microsoft thought that they could have a family sharing system on the Xbox One where you could use the disc once to install your game and never have to use it again. This was at the cost of being able to sell or lend your game to a friend. At most, you would have to pay $10 to activate that game on your friend's Xbox.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360. That's your message. If you don't,
Well,
people don't like it.
if you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device.
No one liked this business model, and if it would have been the death knell for physical games if this was ever done. And Sony obviously wiped the floor with them by embracing the need to share and sell your physical games. And for a while, physical games were still dominant for most people to go and buy. But over the last few years, we've seen a shift towards digital games that I want to explain briefly. So I'm going to ask you a question. Look at your local GameStops and game stores and wonder why they're stocking Funko Pops, gaming merch, and they're trying to sell stuff like warranties and membership programs. Game sales can only go far to keep a company afloat, and these stores can have been hemorrhaging money for years. The shift to digital only pushes this further because at the end of the day, it's not those retailers that are getting the cut. The platform holder receives a 30% share for each sale digitally, and the developer of the games gets 70%. And it's no surprises then that GameStop was recording a sales downturn year on year because the uptake of digital distribution is going up. Game, who are like the main retailer for video games in the UK, at one point in the mid 2010s, they couldn't even afford to pay for stocks of big games years ago. And they owed so much to Sony just to sell copies of Uncharted 4 way back in the day. And as physical media continues to dwindle in overall volume, the cost of running these stores kills any return of investment as well, and that's why you see tons of these stores closing each year. Publishers have also realised that they can save money from not printing game data on all of the disc, and you have to download the game through your console's internet connection. And Activision was the first publishers to do this. They were one of the first publishers to actually do this. They've done this with every Call of Duty since Black Ops 4. Even to this very day, you see major publishers use the internet to not bother to ship games on 2 discs to save money, so you have to rely on the use of the internet to install them. Look at Star Wars Jedi Survivor as an example. That game could have easily been given a 2-disc release, but with the dwindling volume of physical games, EA decided to save money on printing another disc per copy. Forcing a download for games you already own on disc is terrible for preservation. When the servers go down for those downloads you crucially need, how are you going to play the game in the first place? And it's especially not needed for single player games or even multiplayer games with an offline component. And if you probably needed further proof that physical games are being eroded, look at the physical to digital ratio for the entire 8th generation of consoles. In 2013, it only accounted for 5 to 10% of the market. By the time they were due to be succeeded by current gen consoles, the ratio was 50-50. That is an extraordinary shift, and I think at this point it's now fully switched in favour of digital. So this begs the question, what makes an all-digital feature for gaming so appealing or concerning? On the one hand, it provides convenience. You don't really need to worry about space when it comes to the amount of video games that you can access. It's all available on your console through your gaming library. And to tell you the truth, I've been fully digital for a few years now. The last console where I had a sizable physical library was the PlayStation 3. And since last generation, I've just been buying games mostly from the PS Store. It's convenient, and I have a fast enough internet connection to justify this. The same goes for the Switch and the Xbox. I just buy all my games digitally. I guess I'm part of the problem, pretty much. But the biggest problem is that you're buying a license to use it. There's nothing stopping those companies from possibly revoking it someday, which is the biggest risk with digital, alongside delisting games. However, as long as they retain a digital ecosystem going forward with each new console, I'm confident that my purchases can go forward. Digital games also have an issue. It's the platform holder that decides the pricing for video games, and there's no middleman available to counter this apart from companies selling PSN, Xbox Live or eShop codes at a reduced price. They can dictate the pricing, the sales available, and you don't really have an option regardless. PC succeeds at this because there are a range of key sellers available, and Steam openly supports this. The platform holders don't, and they run a closed system for their consoles. So digital is a double-edged sword on that basis, and nothing beats how sentimental the value is for physical media. It feels like you actually own the game, and you can always have it as proof of clear ownership. There's nothing more satisfying than opening up a game and inserting the disc ready to play. And as this decade progresses, it's looking pretty much likely that physical games are well into a decline. And look at Microsoft and Sony's current consoles. Sony sells a PS5 that doesn't even have a disc drive at a loss to encourage larger digital uptake. Microsoft went a step further and created a console that was a smaller, less powerful counterpart to the Xbox Series X with the same aim. A loss leader device to push Game Pass and digital growth. And even if the physical console sold much better, both companies know what they're doing. They're simply cheaper, but the point is to keep it entrenched on the digital ecosystem whilst killing off the middleman. Whilst the PS5's disc variant already sells much better, the Xbox unsurprisingly has the Series S as the better selling system. It's simply cheaper than the Series X and it appeals to a more casual audience. Regardless of the different aims that Sony and Microsoft have, they know that the digital stores bring in more money than ever and they will pivot to that. And I don't know if anyone has noticed this, but Microsoft's own games get less physical prints now because Game Pass exists. Unless you're a collector, the average consumer, they will just spend $15 a month to play Halo Infinite or Starfield or Game Pass. Sony decided for their collector's editions to take into account the existence of the digital edition PS5, and they just outright replaced discs with digital download codes entirely, and even bundles have digital download codes instead of a disc being packaged. They are all in on a digital feature regardless of how negatively the situation impacts physical media entirely. And this year we saw two big releases forego a physical release entirely. Alan Wake 2 and Like a Dragon Gaiden, they are releasing without no physical copy available. The latter game is getting physical release in Asia, but everywhere else you just have to buy it digitally. The justification for Alan Wake 2 being digital only is down to the pricing. Instead of paying $70 for a physical copy, Remedy would rather see you have it buy digitally for $60. I kind of think they have a fair point to make about digital games being easier to distribute like we mentioned before, but at the same time, why not give the option for a physical copy? There's that collectability aspect of it, though it is dwindling, and if you're done with the game, you can give it to a family member, a friend, or you can just sell it entirely. That is not available with digital, unfortunately, and they will definitely not be the last games to ever ditch physical copies entirely. Let's be real, and there's no doubt about it. The future for physical games is bleak. Digital, on the other hand, will most likely become the dominant standard for game distribution by far. It's easier for smaller developers to get their game out without the added costs of printing the game physically, and the limited resources mean that they'd have to buy it digitally anyway. Game stores, they're going to end up reducing their shelf space even more in favour of gaming merch and Funko Pops to make up for physical games selling less and less. When was the last time you ever went to a GameStop, a game, an EB Games, without them literally shoving merch on your face? It's a sad reality, it's only more likely to show as time goes by. Sony and Microsoft, they will feel even more comfortable in trying to push their digital consoles even further. In fact, they are already one step ahead. Look at that leaked Xbox Series X redesign. Do you see a disc drive there? Absolutely not. This thing is adorably all digital, which I think is a joke of a marketing tag if I ever saw one. Microsoft, they're the company most likely to make the switch because they dabbled with digital games before, and they were the first company to do so by far. They had Game Pass as their loss leader product of gaming. They sell less physical games than Sony does, and they've actively promoted their digital store to their core user base. They even have Microsoft Rewards, designed to incentivize your Xbox's digital library. You gain points by playing, and you use them to get gift cards or Xbox Game Pass. And if limited runs bosses are correct, the end of physical Xbox games might be coming sooner than you think. The PS5 Slim's disc drive is detachable, so you at least get the option, but I still kind of think at some point they will just go all digital, but who knows. Nintendo's next console, rumours have a digital only SKU, but when that platform still has a strong user base buying physical copies, why even bother? And I feel like more AAA games are going to be skipping physical copies. I expect more of them to follow through because the cost of printing those copies would outweigh any return on investment. I don't expect the biggest games out there to actually ditch their discs, but I think there's a strong chance that inevitably companies are just going to sit down and think, hey, we can just have a bigger profit margin if we just sell it digitally. Collector's editions, they might just even emulate what Sony did by just including the digital download code. Big stores like Best Buy, Target and Walmart, they will almost certainly phase out physical games in the coming years. Like Best Buy already is removing like Blu-ray discs and DVDs like next year, and I know that Tesco in the UK already got rid of their entire video game inventory, so this is not the only kind of news that we'll be seeing in the next few years. The only real positive news I hear about physical games nowadays is the fact that they still have a large sale margin in Japan at least, where the Nintendo Switch is king, but I suspect that digital will just grow even further. To finish off this video, physical media has always been at the forefront of video games for decades. It was the go-to method for buying a game that you'd enjoy, and the sentimental value that you receive for it is crazy. But we're seeing a massive shift right now towards convenience with digital before our very eyes, and it may not be long before we see a point of no return for physical games as a whole. The future does look bleak, but it will take some time to see whether we really witness a complete shift to digital. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment or subscribe to the channel. It's really appreciated. And if you want more updates on future videos, join my Discord in the description below or follow my Twitter. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.